Although I worked a lot with predator-prey systems, particularly with lynx and black bears and coyotes and wolves and big mammals like caribou and moose, I actually started a lot of my very early animal behavior work with seabirds. I spent a number of years actually studying populations of seabirds on the islands off the coast of Newfoundland. And one of the investigations that I conducted and thoroughly enjoyed, I must say, was studying the breeding behavior and biology of a bird known as the common murre. In Newfoundland, we refer to them as turs. These are black and white seabirds of about this high, which have essentially lost their nest-building habit and have the peculiar behavior of laying a very pointed egg on the bare ledges of rocky islands at sea. The ledges themselves are very narrow, and the ledges are very densely packed with these animals. Thousands and thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of these birds can occupy during the breeding season these very small islands and nest at every ledge from the water's edge almost all the way up to the highest peaks, which in some cases are thousands of feet in the air. One of the things that I was doing was I was trying to understand the embryogenesis, the birth of the chick from the moment that the egg was laid, how the chick developed in the egg, and then, of course, to monitor the survival of the chicks after they hatched. And so I was in the habit of climbing these cliffs, and in other cases going down these cliffs by the use of ropes, and getting onto these very narrow, slippery ledges, slippery from water, obviously, and moisture in these islands, but also slippery from the guano that simply came from having tens of thousands and indeed hundreds of thousands of birds nesting on these cliffs. And they were very intense places because the birds were always screaming and jabbing at one another and fighting one another because they were very densely packed on the ledges, and they were either protecting their egg or, of course, after the egg hatched, they were actually protecting their young chick, which spent about 3 weeks on the ledge before actually going to sea. And I remember this one very calm morning. It was in June, and I was in my normal habit of visiting the various sites around the island where I went to go down and weigh my eggs and look to see if any of them had hatched, and if they had hatched, to band my little chicks and to measure them, of course, so I could get a graph of their growth over time before they went to sea. And I had some pretty risky places that I had to crawl into or crawl over in order to gain access to some of these specimens that, of course, were of such value to me that the risk that was taken was well worth it. One of the particular sites I had involved a place where the ledge had actually fallen away. And so you came across the ledge, pressing your body to the main front of the cliff. And it wasn't a place you could use ropes effectively, so you were freestanding with this. And you had to sort of creep along the edge of the cliff. And then there was a space. And the space wasn't very much. It was only a large step that you would have to make. But in fact, it was necessary for me to step across that chasm to get to the other eggs and chicks that were on the other side. Now, it was not a particularly comfortable thing to do. I mean, every morning that I did it, or usually it was every second day that I did it, you sort of had to prepare yourself to sort of get yourself well balanced and in good form to actually step across this. Some days, of course, it was foggy and windy and blowing rain. But this particular morning, I remember it as of yesterday. It was a beautiful, calm, sunny morning. And so I went to my site and I pressed myself against the cliff and I stepped across this chasm. Just as I was placing my foot on the other side, immediately beneath me, perhaps some 50 feet to the water below, and a series of menacing-looking jagged rocks that protruded from the surface, there was a large humpback whale. And it had come up just underneath me and had blown. And out of his blowhole came this, of course, spray of wonderfully odious water and vapor that drifted up, right up onto me so that I could smell it most intensely and actually feel it even, blowing in the breeze coming onto my clothing and so on and so forth. The shock and surprise of that happening completely unexpectedly underneath me in the waters below nearly toppled me off the ledge. I remember to this day just catching myself just at the moment. I was heavily involved in athletics at the time, and it was probably the only reason I didn't fall off that ledge. But I remember when I finally pressed my hands to the ledge and pressed my face to the rock cliff to gather myself for a moment before extending myself over onto the other part of the ledge, I looked down into the water. And this was the most miraculous piece of this story and this experience of all. Because when I looked down off that ledge and into the water, that humpback was on his side, and one of his great white flippers was extended into the air, and his one massive eye on that side of his head was locked on me. He had come underneath. He had seen this strange creature up on this ledge. He had come up and leisurely blown and sent the water and spray asunder, and then he kept looking at me as he glided along and past the island, and then eventually disappeared under the water and went on his merry way. I measured my specimens that day on the other side of this chasm, and I made my way back, which was not so easy, making my way back across the chasm to the safety of the still very narrow ledges that I climbed around on like a monkey at that time. But I will never forget this moment when I nearly toppled into that ocean and probably would have died because of the rocks I would have landed on below. But more importantly, I remember that day for that moment of connection between this massive, beautiful whale looking up at me and I turning to look down at him. It was a moment of sharing between man and wild nature that remains one of the greatest gifts of my life. I shall never, ever forget it.